Welcome to day 2 of the Brattleboro Literary Festival. We are so excited to be here this morning with Jessica Pearce Rotondi and Maya Shanbhag Lang. If you have questions for them, the Q&A button allows you to ask questions during the event. So please submit your questions there and upvote questions that are already asked using the thumbs up icon. Families are complicated, and the people closest to you are often the ones you understand the least. Jessica and Maya's books make new discoveries about their families that take apart the myths and perceptions they have known all their lives. Jessica Pearce Rotondi is a writer and editor living in Brooklyn. Her work has been published by the History Channel, Time, Vogue, and many others. What We Inherit is her first book. Maya Shanbhag Lang is the author of the New York Times Book Review Editor's Pick, an Amazon Book of 2020, and a Parade Magazine Best Memoir. She is also the author of the novel The 16th of June. She holds a PhD in comparative literature and lives in New York with her daughter. Hello, Jessica and Maya. Tell us a little bit more about your books.
Sure. Maya, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, first, Sandy, thank you. And thank you for everyone for tuning in. I'm so excited to be here with Jessica, who's amazing. What We Inherit, I just started, and it is enthralling and absorbing. And we have so many thematic parallels. So I think this will be a really great discussion, not only title parallels, but so many other things. Anyway, my memoir, What We Carry, is on one level about how my life changed overnight when I became my mother's caregiver. She had been a geriatric psychiatrist and an expert in Alzheimer's, and she was able to mask her Alzheimer's symptoms quite well until suddenly she couldn't. So I became her full-time caregiver while also caring for my young daughter. So what my book is really about is when your life changes overnight and you're suddenly in a juncture that you never imagined, and you're facing things that are quite overwhelming, and you wonder what your life is going to look like and how you're going to do it, which I think speaks to our current times. It is about when our parents stop being who we want or need them to be. And it is about what happens when women choose ourselves and center ourselves.
Yes. And Maya's book is absolutely beautiful. And, we both are going to talk a lot more about our mothers today, but I really have to say how deeply and beautifully this resonated as another caregiver of a parent. What We Inherit actually begins in the wake of my mother's death. I was 23 years old when I uncovered boxes of declassified CIA documents and letters and maps in my childhood home that all pointed to a family secret. And that was my mom's missing brother, Jack, who disappeared when his plane was shot down over Laos on March 29th, 1972, and just never came home. And the crash Jack survived eerily echoed one my grandfather had survived back in World War II. He parachuted out of a burning plane, was captured by the Nazis, and spent 3 years in Stalag 17 prison camp. So because my grandpa survived, he always believed his son was going to come home too, and he spent the rest of his life looking for him. So in 2013, after my mom's death, I went to Laos in search of the last known place Jack was seen alive, recreating my grandfather's trip there from the 70s. And what I found there brought me closer to the mom and the grandpa I missed so much, but also the legacy of a war that left Laos the most heavily bombed country in the entire world. So the book is a mix of memoir, it's a mix of investigative reporting. I talked to CIA officers and veterans and refugees for this book, but it's also a little bit of history. So I hope you all enjoy What We Inherit.
So the titles of your book are so similar, and I think, it kind of looks at the fact that, what happens in our lives with our families is we sort of, we carry that around with us. And so, from one book is, Maya's book, What We Carry, and then What We Inherit, Jessica's book. Can you talk a little bit about what those meant to you as titles?
Sure. What We Inherit is actually a line from a poem by Lord Byron called Prometheus. Jack was shot down in a plane called Prometheus. And according to the Greek myth that Byron writes about, Prometheus is this titan that brought fire to man. And as punishment, the gods strapped him to a mountain. And depending on the version of the story that you have heard, an eagle either eats his liver or his heart every single night. So he's never quite living and he's never quite dead. He's kind of caught in this in between. And for me, that was such a symbol of Jack for my family for 36 years. For decades, the Air Force documents sealed with an eagle would throw my family from hope and to despair and back again. And in Byron's poem, he says, "A mighty lesson we inherit, thou art a symbol and a sign to mortals of thy fate divine." And kind of going through my family's history and the way they mourn for Jack, I inherited, yes, this way of grieving and this trauma, but I also inherited ways of, I think, coping with it and learning to kind of go back into the past to move on into the present. So it had a lot of different resonances for me, but yeah, it did come from my uncle's plane originally. Yeah.
That's an amazing story.
That's an amazing story. And it's so eerily apt, that line, the fact that the plane was called Prometheus. It's one of these things that you can't get away with in fiction, right? Like in a novel, it would be too close, too on the nose. So life it's strange how these coincidences pile up. For me, I'll tell you a funny story, which was that the original title of my book was actually The Woman in the River, because my book starts off with this myth that my mother tells me about a woman in a river who is carrying her child in her arms, and she needs to cross this river. The water begins to rise. She's faced with this dilemma of, does she let go of her child and enable her own survival, or does she sacrifice herself and enable the survival of her child? And when my mother first told me this story, I thought, this is like the classic Indian story and the classic story of motherhood, where of course the woman gives herself up for her child. This is how all these stories go. I was a new mother who was overwhelmed. And my mother surprised me and she said, the lesson of the story is that we can never judge the woman in the river. There is no ending to the story. We don't know how the story turns out, because until you are that woman, feeling the panic of the water rising to your chest and feeling overwhelmed and paralyzed, until you are her, you don't know how difficult that moment is. So the book was supposed to be called The Woman in the River. And as we were working on it, there was this flood of titles that were very similar. Like the woman on the train, the woman it was women in all kinds of places, women and girls and cabins and trains. And so we didn't want the book to get lost in that mix or be thought of as like a thriller. And then we started thinking about the fact that the book is really about all the stuff that we as women and as people carry, meaning the different roles that we often inhabit, and the stories that we also tell ourselves about who we are and our choices, and how we self-label ourselves or carry around labels from our families that can sometimes be completely false, yet shape us and our decisions and choices so much. So I think What We Carry actually ended up being a much better title, but the path to it was an interesting one. And I think it's one of these like behind the scenes things with publishing that as readers, we often don't know how these things come about.
You, what made you decide to write a memoir? Was there something that you were trying to just sort of get it out of your head, or was it something that you made a conscious decision to do? Just why a memoir? Were you worried about the process, or?
Yeah, so For me, actually, I never intended to write a memoir ever. You know, I probably would have listed it as something that I would never do. And I was in the middle of working on my second novel. I'd always really thought of myself as a fiction writer. And while I was suddenly caring for my mom and my life changed overnight, I began as a coping mechanism to write Facebook posts, because I would have 5 minutes during the day when I could just sort of let the steam out of the pressure cooker that had become my life. And an editor happened to see those posts, and she reached out and said, "Do you think you could write a book out of all of this? Because I see a story here." And I said, "No, you know, I'm flattered, but there's no way I could do it." And that same night I wrote, I think, 50 pages. And so it's one of these things where I think sometimes in life we don't realize how much we're dealing with or how much we need to tell our story until we start to do it. And it took someone else pointing that out to me for me to realize, oh yeah, I'm really not only grappling with a lot here, but there's a lot that might help others and speak to others. Part of what was eye-opening to me was that when I started writing these posts, people reached out from all over talking about how they had felt when they were caregivers. And in some cases, it was people I knew, and I just never imagined that they'd gone through something similar. And then there were strangers who were chiming in as well. And it was sort of like, you know, if you wake up one day and you have like a weird mark on your body and you think, oh my God, what is that? But then you share it and a bunch of people show that they have the same mark. And you think, God, how crazy was it that I ever imagined that I was alone? And I think this is really the beauty of books, is that they show us that we have so much more in common than we would ever guess at, you know, just by glancing at one another.
That's a beautiful observation, and it's so true. I think a lot of people read and discover that there are people out there like them when maybe they live somewhere where they're completely, you know, one of a kind. And so you do read to sort of align with life, as well as to know there's another life out there. What about you, Jessica?
Yeah, I just first want to respond to Maya's response. I love the idea of a mark that we carry on our bodies. I mean, what a beautiful way to kind of describe what memoir is. Like, you know, no matter what experience we go through, of course, they mark us in some way, but it's definitely not visible. It's always often this hidden thing. And I kind of found that with memoir as well, especially during the pandemic. When you put your personal life out there, it's terrifying and it's scary, right? But the incredible response of, I lost my mother too. I had this complicated relationship too. There is that strength and community, especially in kind of an isolating time. But like Maya, I never ever thought I would write a memoir. I'm a journalist by training. And when I first started writing this book, I was at the Huffington Post, and I thought I would do this very reported story on this war that few Americans knew about. I was really determined to do the deeply investigative reporting I was excited to do. I had my sources. And as I was writing, I was spending almost every morning before work, like 13-hour work days, early mornings in bed, with these piles of documents I had inherited from my grandparents. And one box of my grandfather's letters, I was going through it, and something cold and metallic fell onto my lap. And it was actually Jack's dog tag, which I didn't know my family had. And holding that, it felt like I could imagine what my grandfather felt holding that. My mother felt holding that. It was returned Christmas 1984, the year before I was born. I later put the timelines together, and that's when I realized this story had to be personal. You know, history becomes real when it becomes personal. I could not be this objective reporter writing about this war because my family was directly involved in it. And I think the strength of the book now is that intersection of memoir with the greater history. But it was definitely not the book I set out to write. It just kind of became, as the investigation evolved, more of this hybrid. And throughout the book, I also included a lot of these primary documents for the reader, because I wanted them to kind of discover things alongside me. I'm trying to take a picture of it now, but yeah, I think memoir opens a lot of doors to kind of getting people personally, and then you can kind of flip them onto larger issues, whether it's Alzheimer's or a war or cancer. I think there's just so many things we can explore by putting ourselves out there in perhaps a vulnerable or unexpected way, and going from there.
Yeah, and just to build off of what Jessica said, I think this is so funny with memoir that sometimes your opening into it might be one thing, but then you cannot control where that process takes you, right? So, I mean, with your book in particular, it starts off where we really have this like suspenseful sense of like a secret and something that we want to decipher and figure out. And yet, and with my book as well, I started off thinking, okay, my in with this is that I'm going to write it because there are caregivers out there and people dealing with Alzheimer's, family members who have Alzheimer's. And the pragmatic part of me was like, I will help those people. And weirdly, like, my editor would come back to me and say, okay, I want you to write more about, like, you kind of talk about how hard it was for you when your daughter was born. Say more about that. And so suddenly I was writing about postpartum depression, or, you mentioned that your dad is difficult. Say more about that. So suddenly it's like you start going in these directions that not only did you not anticipate, but like your body kind of starts screaming at you like, no, don't write it like that. That's way too vulnerable. We don't want to go there. But that's actually, I think, what the reader most needs. And maybe the biggest gifts of memoir are those really uncomfortable things that, Jess, you were just talking about, that are so terrifying to give voice to. But that's how we enter that space of communing with the reader and really saying, you're not alone. It's not by what we set out to write about, thinking like, oh, here's how I can be helpful. It's the stuff where you think, I cannot possibly say that or share that.
Absolutely.
So both of you, your memoir writing was sort of triggered by your mother's illness. And the idea that, when they became ill, suddenly all of these, the past was sort of opened up, and a past that you really didn't know. Can you talk about that a little bit and kind of tell us what was different?
Yeah, I mean, when my mother was sick, she was such an emblem of strength. She was journaling about her experience with illness publicly and making jokes. She was making her doctors and her nurses laugh. She was so strong. And, as her daughter, I was terrified. And I now know that as my mother, she was terrified too, but we didn't let ourselves communicate that. We were just too busy trying to be tough for the other person. And I really, only after her death, realized where that came from. And that was absolutely her father, right? There's moments in the book where, my grandfather was a doer, much like my mother. My mom was donating her time and doing experimental treatments to help other women, even as she herself was sick. My grandfather was touring the country advocating for POWs and MIAs, even though he himself was a former prisoner of war and maybe needed treatment and maybe needed some time to deal with his own grief. He couldn't grieve because he was so busy being active. And I think in the same way, when my mom died, I was looking for some kind of message from her, some kind of, how do I live without you? What do you want me to do? And what I found instead was a chance to kind of meet her at my age. She lost Jack at the same age I lost her. And, there are all these things I wish I could go back and say to her while she was sick. I was, that wasn't the relationship that we had, right? But I think through writing this book, I did get to say a lot of things, or ask a lot of the things, and answer, in some cases, a lot of the things that I had wondered about for years. And I think that's the beauty of family. While we often have, every family has taboos, things we don't talk about, through the process of memoir writing, or even reading a beautiful memoir like Maya's, I think you're always inspired, or I always am, to then speak to people that are there, whether it's a sibling or an aunt or uncle, someone that survived it as well, and kind of get a different version of the story. And as we age, the story changes too. When I started to write this book, I was really a grieving daughter looking for my mom. But by the end of it, every other chapter is my grandfather's point of view, searching for his son. And I identified more with that man aging and still uncovering new things. And I hope to continue that process too as I age, as I become a mother, go through these other milestones. I think I'll understand her even more deeply as time goes on.
I have chills, Jessica Pearce Rotondi. I do. I really do. I think that's so exactly right. And I think that idea that I always think of Russian nesting dolls, that we all reside in one another and nothing is ever lost. I think that's the hardest part of grief, is the idea that someone has fallen away and is no longer with us. But it turns out that is not true. I mean, they're always there. We're always continuing to talk with them and commune with them and sift through our inheritance and process it and process those stories. That's so exactly right. And that act of storytelling and retelling those stories is really, I think, an act of sense making, right? And so, I grew up being told, I had very scientific Indian parents. My mother was a psychiatrist, but not like a therapist. She had no interest in hearing people's stories. She just wanted to diagnose them and get them on the correct medication. So she was really basically a chemist. And my father was an engineer. And what they both told me was that stories were frivolous and silly, and that my interest in fiction and writing was like, kind of this hilarious, like, equivalent of wanting to be, like a, I don't know, like a Michael Jackson impersonator or something, like it was treated at the. But what I came to realize in writing this memoir is that no, stories are not frivolous. I mean, stories are not some sort of like embellishment to life. I think ultimately stories are life, because we're constantly trying to understand ourselves and assert ourselves and decipher the characters around us. And in my case, I mean, my mother, who had presented herself as this very no-nonsense clinical person, what I found out during her dementia was that she was more of a fiction writer than I am, in the sense that the stories that she had told me growing up were these very carefully curated, versions of herself that weren't actually often true. And they had a sort of suspicious lack of detail and would have these big omissions. And during her dementia, the truth started coming out because she no longer had the capacity to remember what she used to tell me. So the truth sort of came out accidentally. And I learned all of these secrets about her and my family that really sent me reeling. But I also, often we talk about Alzheimer's and illness, understandably, for the terrible grief that they cause. There is a strange gift that came many gifts that came from that time with her, in that I finally got to see her in this very different way, in a vulnerable way. And I got to learn all these things about her that I never would have learned otherwise. So I would say that was eye-opening and helped me reprocess and navigate and sort of think about all of this stuff that I had been just sort of putting on myself without realizing it.
Okay, that's great. So we have a few questions here. For Jessica, when you got to Laos and started asking questions, what were the reaction of the Laotians, and what was that you were, what was it what you were expecting?
Yeah, and thank you for the question, Sarah. Sarah is the executive director of Legacies of War, which is an organization dedicated
to nice.
Education and bomb removal, because there's still 50 people a year at least dying of these bombs left behind 40 years ago, most of them children. It's horrific. And when I got to Laos, I kind of found the war is still very much alive there. In the United States, it's called the Secret War. It was run by it wasn't on American television. We were watching Cambodia and Vietnam, not so much Laos. It was a neutral country during the time. We were literally not there, if you ask the government at the time. And on the ground there are bomb craters in people's front yards. I'll never forget it. I was walking to the village. My uncle had been bombing the night he disappeared, and there's a bomb crater in someone's literal front yard. And above it was a laundry line. And there was a little boy's, maybe 3 or 4 year olds, pajamas dangling on this line. It was a Superman pajama. You think of Superman as a symbol of American heroism and, doing good in the world. And here it was over a bomb left by Americans. And
wow.
And as we started to approach villagers, people kind of ran away from us. There's a lot of timidity. I did have a translator. He eventually got us through. And that's because I later realized you can be jailed or even killed for talking about the war. The police had actually been to the village the previous week because people were asking too many questions. There were pockets of resistance for liberation up until the early 2000s in Laos.
Whoa.
So it's still very much a part of people's families and grandparents, aunts and uncles, and even to some extent the current generation. So I actually got a lot of my answers when I came back into this country, talking to refugees who have more, or descendants of them who have more access to stories or more freedom to tell their stories. But there really was censorship on both sides, the United States and Laos. But what the power of going to Laos was not finding these answers I thought I magically could have. You know, morally, I did not have the right to ask these people to put their lives in danger. That's just not something I was willing to do. But what I did, I think, realize while going there was just the enormity of this war and how it's still something that, you know, people, children walking to school or farmers tilling their fields, they can still die from something that happened 50 years ago that had nothing to do with them. And that really galvanized me to write the book and make it more about kind of educating the American public too about what we did there and what we can still do and the work that still needs to be done.
That's so perfect. Well, there are a few more questions, and I think I may ask you guys to answer these offline, and we'll communicate them back to the audience people that ask these questions. But before you go, do you want to give a shout out to your books? You can buy the books at bookshop.org, and I don't know. Maya has hers on display. Jessica, do you have a?
I have Jessica.
There you go. And there's Maya's right there, if anybody can see it. So yeah, okay, perfect. Thank you guys so much. It was great to talk to you this morning.
Thank you. It was great.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.